Hey, my name's Matt Kennedy, and this is the Steadfast Podcast. This podcast exists to use Bible study and theological teaching to encourage you to be steadfast in your faith. Thank you for taking time out of your day to check out the Steadfast Podcast. I hope today's episode is an encouragement to you. Last week, we talked about the cornerstone of our faith, and that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He was laid in the tomb gifted to him by this guy named Joseph of Arimathea. Yet on the third day, he rose from the dead, proving he is the Son of God, proving that our hope is not in vain, proving that death does not get the final say. His resurrection occurred on a Sunday, and that's why churches gather on Sundays for worship. Now, the disciples know Jesus has risen, and it appears word has spread quickly. But the only thing is, I'm not sure that everyone actually believes what they're hearing. They've heard this absolutely incredible news that Jesus, who was crucified, who was laid in the tomb because he was dead, is now alive again. Someone rising from the dead would be difficult news to wrap one's head around. So let's pick back up with Luke 24, starting in verse 13. Quote, "That very day, 2 of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, 'What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?' And they stood still, looking sad." End quote. Let's start with a fun fact. 2 witnesses were required by the law for a claim to be valid. Quite the coincidence that there happened to be 2 men walking from Jerusalem 7 miles to Emmaus. The book of Luke gives us some beautiful symmetry. You may remember that early on in the Gospel of Luke, the arrival of 41-day-old Jesus was witnessed by 2 people, Simeon and Anna. So the arrival of Jesus onto the scene had 2 witnesses. And in today's passage, we are going to get 2 witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. Luke's goal is to give a reliable account through and through. Little details like this aid that goal. They might not mean as much to some of us today as they meant to people back then, but such detail add to the authenticity and the reliability of Luke writing to Theophilus. Okay, so there are 2 men. What is going on in these opening verses? These 2 witnesses are walking down the road and they're talking about Jesus. They are disciples of Jesus, not the 12, but they are in the larger group of disciples who followed Jesus. Then as a plot twist, guess who joins them? Jesus himself. And he's like, "Hey, what are you guys talking about?" It says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. They've got no idea who this is that is in front of them. And that actually fits a pattern. You see, Mary didn't recognize Jesus. John chapter 20, verses 14 through 16 tell us, quote, "Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing. But she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, 'Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?' Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, 'Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away.' Jesus said to her, 'Mary.' She turned and said to him in Aramaic, 'Rabboni,' which means teacher." End quote. A whole boat of disciples didn't recognize Jesus. In John 21 verse 4, quote, "Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus." End quote. That "did not know" is the same word we'd use for "did not recognize." Why couldn't they see Jesus, the man, the God-man, right in front of them? In our passage here in Luke, it says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So what does that even mean? What or who was keeping their eyes from recognizing him? Maybe his appearance was radically different. That's possible. I haven't seen any before or after pictures, so I can't eliminate that one. Then there are those who believe it was God who kept their eyes from seeing. That is also a possible explanation of what's going on. But I don't think that fits the flow of this passage, because later on, Jesus will call them foolish for being so slow to believe. I don't think Jesus would call them foolish if it was the Father who was keeping them from recognizing him. I could be wrong, for sure, 100%, but I think they were experiencing a powerful mixture of grief, of confusion, fear, and yes, a lack of faith. That is a powerful and disorienting mixture. We cannot forget that we are talking about real human beings in a real time, in a real place, who have real emotions. The true-to-life humanity of so many people within the Bible also give credit to the Bible's authenticity and reliability. So many details you would not include if you were trying to make up a legend, because frankly, the details don't always make important figures look very good. Sometimes, circumstances can have us all turned around so that we cannot see or think straight. The most obvious thing could be right there in front of us, but we are emotional creatures. And sometimes what we feel and the clouds that can come from those feelings can get the best of us. I'm betting every person listening could name a time in their life when their emotions caused them to think or act in a way that wasn't really normal. Just like the Snickers commercial that says, "You're not you when you're hungry." Sometimes we can be so grieved, so confused, so afraid, so even angry that we are not ourselves in that moment. Let's pick back up in verse 18. Quote, "Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, 'Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days?'" End quote. There's a church tradition that says Cleopas was the brother of Joseph, Joseph being Jesus' earthly dad. Though he shared no biology with Joseph, Joseph did step in as an earthly father figure. I tried to chase down the tradition that Cleopas could be the earthly uncle of Jesus, but the best I can tell is it doesn't show up until about 250 to 300 years later when this historian named Eusebius wrote it. So it's probably not true. If things or traditions don't show up for 200 or 300 years after the fact, it's probably a detail that got added along the way. So in reality, we really have no idea who this guy is, but he was likely a relatively well-known guy in the early church, which is why Luke would name drop him here. Using someone who is known to at least some of the public would have added only to the credibility of what he's saying. For us, living nearly 2,000 years later, we won't know until heaven, but I bet Cleopas went on to do wonderful things in the name of Jesus. Or maybe he was a horrible heretic that said awful things. But I choose optimism in this. Since we don't know and since we can't really know, I'm going to choose to hope that he went on and did wonderful and awesome things. But whoever he is, he probably regrets speaking so condescendingly to Jesus about, well, Jesus. He definitely had no idea this conversation would be read by Jesus' followers 2,000 years later. The conversation continues in verse 19 and following. Quote, "And he said to them, 'What things?' And they said to him, 'Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women in our company amazed us. They were at the tomb earlier in the morning, and they did not find his body. They came back saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." End quote. So they start filling Jesus in on the story of Jesus, but they got some stuff a little bit mixed up. They called him a prophet. Now, Jesus was a prophet, however, he was much more than a prophet. To say that he was merely a prophet kind of gives the wrong idea about who Jesus was and what Jesus was doing. It would be kind of like saying that there's this guy named Michael Jordan who likes to bounce a ball every once in a while. You know, I mean, like, true, yes, he does like to dribble a basketball, but that really doesn't give you the picture of who Michael Jordan was or what he accomplished or the 6 championships that he won or the gold medal that he won or the MVPs that he won or the All-NBA teams that he was on or all of his accomplishments. To say he just likes to bounce a ball around doesn't give you the full picture. Calling Jesus a prophet, while true, misses the full picture infinitely more than what I just said about Michael Jordan. Now, remember what verse 17 said, quote, "And he said to them, 'What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?' And they stood still, looking sad." End quote. As they're talking, they're standing still, they're looking sad. That's not really the body language of someone who believes Jesus is alive. It's the body language of someone who feels defeated. Verse 21 said, quote, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened." End quote. Obviously, hoped is past tense, not we are hoping, we had hoped. In other words, they're saying our hopes didn't really pan out the way we wanted them to. We were hopeful, but then our hopes were crushed. The more puzzle pieces we put together, the more the picture becomes clear. They know people are saying Jesus is alive, but they are not believing it. There was some amazement at the women's report, but they haven't seen anything to suggest that Jesus has really risen from the dead, or at least they haven't seen anything that they're aware of. When you consider the fact that they are leaving Jerusalem, that they are headed to a village called Emmaus, and shortly they'll talk about a place that they have to stay there, it is reasonable for us to conclude that these guys have given up and are going home. In this moment, grief, fear, confusion, a lack of faith had them pretty well defeated. Let's pick back up in verse 25, quote, "And he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." End quote. In verse 25, Jesus refers to these two witnesses as foolish ones. That is what I referenced before when I said these witnesses were blinded by something other than God himself. Their slow recognition was a matter of their heart. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus continually pointed out how he was going to die, how he was going to rise, and yet no one seemed to understand. Peter even took Jesus aside on one occasion to suggest that maybe he should not be teaching this to people. Remember what he said? He says, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind on the things of man, not the things of God." Jesus here again says the cross was necessary. He had to be the once and for all sacrifice. He then starts teaching them about the Old Testament. Now, if Jesus is teaching this class in heaven, I want to sign up. I can't imagine what it would be like to hear Jesus walk through the Old Testament and point out how it all leads to him. In that day, to say Moses and the prophets was one way to say all of the scriptures, all of the Old Testament. So they're walking along getting the ultimate master's class from Jesus, and they still have got no idea who they're talking to. Isn't that something else? Now let's continue in verse 28. Quote, "So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he was going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, 'Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent.' So he went in to stay with them." End quote. They invite Jesus to stay a while, and they want to hear more. I mean, this must be an incredible masterclass that they are getting. The teaching was surely the type of stuff that would keep you on the edge of your seat, that you just have to hear more. So Jesus agrees to stay with them. And now in verse 30 and 31, we see it is dinner time. Quote, "When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight." End quote. Remember, 2 witnesses were required by law for a claim to be viable. If there were not 2 witnesses, this would be hard to believe. As soon as they're like, "Hey, this is Jesus," he just disappears into thin air. If there was only one guy there, it would be easy to think grief just got the better of him. But there were 2. This was a viable witness. This really happened. Here's the thing. They were in a bad place, and Jesus literally met them where they were and gave them exactly what they needed. How do we know he gave them exactly what they needed? Look at their reaction in verses 32 through 35. Quote, "They said to each other, 'Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?' And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, 'The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon.' And they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread." End quote. Their hearts burned within them when Jesus spoke to them. They were rejuvenated. He gave them exactly what they needed. They were in this dark place of grief, of confusion, of fear, of disappointment. Their hopes that they had for Jesus had been crushed because they thought the story was over. They thought all the things that they were excited about were for naught. It was reality and expectations in their mind in that moment were 2 things that couldn't be further apart. And yet, as soon as their eyes were opened, the grief had been dispelled, their worries, their fears had had been cast away, and they saw that it was Jesus in front of them. Everything changed. These guys immediately got up and went back to Jerusalem. They traveled 7 miles at nighttime. Now, that would have been risky. They can't exactly just hop in the car and go down the road. Let me tell you, this is not something you would typically do. It was a dangerous thing to travel by night up towards Jerusalem. Listen to Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. Quote, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. End quote. This is the opening of a song of ascent. Songs God's people would sing as they approached Jerusalem. You see, they had to travel up through roads that were hilly, through roads that had so many places that robbers and other evildoers could hide and ambush them along the way. This was a perilous journey full of danger. The psalmist is lifting up their eyes to the hills because they are scanning for threats. But here on this journey, they know the Lord will protect them. Where does their help come from? It comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. These two witnesses did not care about the threats or the danger of traveling this dangerous road at night. Where they were once grieved and confused and afraid, now they are full of faith. They are full of courage because Jesus had changed everything. He met them where they were. He gave them what they needed, and everything in their life was going to be different. That is why I believe this guy, Cleopas, who is named here, went on to do amazing things because he got to encounter Jesus. And Jesus met him where he was and changed his life, I believe. I know there are so many times we are in the same emotional state as these guys were, where we are grieved by life situations, where we had hopes of things turning out one way and they didn't go our way, where we are filled with disappointment and anxiousness and worry and just frustration. Maybe we're angry and we can't get out of that cloud of anger, and all of these things and maybe so many other things can leave us feeling so overwhelmed that we've taken our hope off of the one who was crucified and rose again. Sometimes when we are so overwhelmed, what we need to do is refocus our eyes on Jesus. We need to remember that he is bigger than any trial we could ever face. We need to remember that he is there for us and loves us so much. Maybe feelings of being overwhelmed can remind us that we're not actually relying on Jesus, that maybe, just maybe, we are overwhelmed because we are trying to control everything on our own, even though we're not meant to. Maybe, since we are trying to handle everything under our own power and our own understanding, we are getting in over our heads when we have a Savior who says stuff like Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. He says, quote, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." End quote. The good news that we can get from the passage that we read today is that these witnesses can confirm that Christ has indeed risen from the grave, and because Christ has risen, the hopeless have turned to hopeful. Fear has turned to courage. Mourning has turned to joy. As 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 54 through 57 tell us, quote, "When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on the immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is in the law. But thanks be to God who gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." End quote. If it were possible to somehow invite these two witnesses onto this podcast, they would tell you that Christ is indeed risen from the grave, and that changes everything about life. Thanks for listening to the Steadfast Podcast. I want to remind you that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, Paul wrote this, quote, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." End quote. So in light of biblical truth, let us be steadfast, immovable. Let us remember that through Jesus, not one labor is in vain, not one trial is in vain, not one effort in all of our lives is in vain. Because he gives purpose. and that purpose rings through eternity. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget, if you've got questions you would like answered, you can email me at matt@steadfastpodcast.com.